Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to draw cat eyes in acrylics. Now the layering process that I'm using here could also be applied for painting with oils, but I do like to work with more of a structure. So the first thing that I like to do is map in the highlights of the eye. This just is one of those reference points so that I know exactly where that highlight should be. Once I've done that, I'm then going to map in the black and darkest part of the outside of the eye. The reason I like to do this is so that I know I've got it accurate to that reference photo, because the shape of the eye is obviously really important. If the shape of the eye is not right, whether or not you make it too round or too oval, it's just going to not resemble as much like that animal as it should. So the eye shape is the first thing I want to make sure I get right. For this, depending on the size of painting that you're working on, I would recommend to use a small brush. I'm using just a standard small sized round brush, and here you can see I'm able to get fairly fine lines. Once I was happy with the outside edge, I then painted in the pupil. Now again, just like the outside shape of the eye, the pupil is really important. If we put that in the wrong position, it's going to make the cat look like it's staring in a different way, and it's just not going to have the same look that that eye should have. It's going to affect the expression and the emotion. So those two things are really important. Once I've then done that, I'm then blocking in my base layer. Now if you would like to see all of this in real time, I have the full tutorial available on Patreon. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list, so all of the supplies that I'm using. If that's of interest, I will link that in the description below. Now regardless of the element that I'm working on, so a cat eye, nose, fur, anything at all, it's all about the layering process. Now I do have a close-up eye cat study, it's absolutely beautiful, available as a tutorial here on YouTube. So if that's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now as you can see here, I'm applying a lighter colour and then I'm tinting that colour with a glaze. Now glazes is something that I use in all of my paintings, regardless of the layer that I'm working on. Glazes don't have to be kept for that final layer. They can certainly help to adjust all of that colour in the final layer, but I do like to use glazes throughout the layering process to build up more depth in my piece. Now glazing, the layering, all of the colours, these are elements that I speak in depth in my Patreon versions. Because they're significantly slower, they're often all in real time, I can really explain each process thoroughly. But with acrylics, when you're working with glazes, you really don't have to worry about mixing the exact colour. For instance here, I am using a lighter colour. It is on the green end of the colour wheel, but it may not be accurate. I can wait for that layer to dry and then mix a glaze. I just like using water for my glazes. No glazing medium for me is required. I then mix the colour that I can see in my reference photo, and then I apply that to my painting to tint the colour of the details underneath. This really does eliminate all of the stress and worry that can be caused when trying to mix the exact colour at every single layer. We really don't have to worry about that with acrylics. They're such a versatile medium and they are really lovely to work with. You saw me there apply more of a like a yellower green, more of a vibrant green. That's a prime example. I was putting my lighter greens down first and then tinting that colour to get more of that vibrant green in place. I did not have to worry about mixing that exact shade of green. Now of course, when working with glazes, it is about the consistency of the paint. You want to make sure that it's thin enough that it still shows all the details underneath. You don't want it too opaque or too thick, because then you're just basically painting an additional layer on top. You're then going to be hiding the layers underneath. So there is a bit of a fine balance, and as I said, if glazing is something that you would like to see more of, I cover it in all of my Patreon tutorials. Now if you've seen other videos of mine here on YouTube, you'll know that even if I work with the fur, I always say to paint what is furthest away and closest to the skin and build up from there. Now that is still always the case when I'm working on eyes. You saw that brown line on the lower right corner of the left eye added in last. I made sure that was the final detail, because for me that was sitting on the very top. I had to make sure that I painted in all of the iris detail, the individual brushstrokes first, and then I could paint the details that to me look like they're sat on top last. Now one of the biggest tips when painting eyes of any animal is all in the shading. We want to make sure that we've got that round 3D sphere shape of the eye right, because otherwise they're going to look very flat and two-dimensional. So you'll notice on this case here that the shadow is on the top portion of the eye. This is really important, and it is going to depend on the light source of the reference photo that you're working from, but most of the time there is always going to be a subtle shadow on the very top edge. The reason being, the skin and fur that are above the eye are always going to be slightly closer to the viewer, so more in front. Therefore, that means it's going to cast a shadow on the lower edge of that section of skin, which is therefore on the top of the eye. So this shadow here is really important. Now, as I've said, the light source is going to vary massively depending on the reference photo that you've got. Sometimes you're also going to have these shadows on the outer edges of the eyes as well. So here I would always recommend to zoom into your reference photo if you're using a tablet, which is my preferred method. Zoom into that eye and really notice all these subtle shadows and highlights. Now, something else that's really important is one eye is not going to be exactly the same as the other. Again, this is all going to be due to the light source. So on this cat here, as you can see in the photo of my finished painting in the lower corner, there was more of a stronger right-sided light source. So if you look at the left side of the cat, the white fur on the chest, that's more of a darker grey. So I want to make sure that I've captured that light source in the eyes. The right eye that I'm currently painting now is therefore much more lighter and vibrant with colour. I really want to make sure that I've captured that. If I paint both eyes of a similar lighting, it's just not going to look right and the painting's not going to have as much impact. The light source is so important. Now, one of the common questions that I'm asked is how many layers do I need to paint on something like eyes, nose, fur? Now, it's really hard to answer that question because it's going to vary depending on the reference photo. But for something like this, I would always say I do a minimum of 8 layers, 10 layers, and you can see here by the process, although it's sped up, you can see that it's not about just 2 or 3 layers. I am working with a really good base foundation and then I'm building up the texture of the iris from there. Now, I speak about this a lot in all of my YouTube tutorials and you see that extensively in my slower Patreon tutorials. I do believe that the base foundation is really important. I want to make sure that I've spent an extra few minutes getting that accurate to the reference photo. Because it is our foundation for the details, it makes a really big difference if that base foundation is as good as we can get it at the early stage. I always start with the eyes first, so once I've done my background, the eyes on any subject will be the very first thing that I paint. The reason being, I want to make sure that they are accurate to the reference photo because if you get the eyes wrong, the entire portrait is just not going to look right. I always want to make sure as well that I get the eyes fairly completed. When I work on fur or other elements like that, you'll often hear me say that I get it about 80% complete and then I go back to it. Now, of course, I can make changes to the eyes later on, but I do want to make sure that they are pretty much done before I move on to any other element. So I hope that the tips and techniques that I've shared here have been useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up because it makes a real difference. If you'd also like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube in the next couple of days. And as always, thank you so much for watching.